I'm sorry, sir, but you do not belong here. I need you to leave immediately.
To the 200 people gathered here today, let me be clear. The accountability stops with me. We will move forward with complete transparency.
They grabbed him by the arm in front of 200 people and told him he didn't belong there. Not a polite redirection. Not a quiet word. A grip, firm, deliberate, the kind that assumes the answer before it asks the question. He was standing in the wrong terminal, they said. He was causing a disruption, they said. The man they were removing had just landed a deal that morning worth more money than the airline's entire regional fleet. What happened next would not stay in that terminal. It would not stay quiet, it would not stay private, and it would absolutely not stay unpunished, though not in the way anyone watching that afternoon might have expected. Because the man they put their hands on, the man they talked over, dismissed, and publicly humiliated in front of a crowd of travelers, airline employees, and at least one journalist who happened to be passing through, was not just a passenger. He was Marcus Elliot Webb. And before this story was over, he would make a decision that sent shockwaves through the entire aviation industry, a decision that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with something far more lasting. But to understand what happened in that terminal, and why it mattered the way it did, we have to understand who Marcus really was. Where he came from. What it had cost him to stand in that terminal at all. And we have to understand one other person, a woman across town who had no idea yet that her morning was about to change completely. Hold on. Because this one is going to stay with you. It was the kind of October afternoon that couldn't make up its mind. The sky over Hartwell International Airport was doing that thing it does in the Mid-South in autumn, half blue, half the color of old pewter, the light coming in at an angle that made everything look both warmer and more tired than it actually was. The sun sat low and flat behind a gauze of thin cloud, casting a long amber wash across the east-facing windows of Terminal D's upper concourse. Dust motes floated in the angled beams like they had nowhere better to be. Inside, the terminal smelled the way all airports smell, a complicated layering of recycled air, jet fuel carried in on coats and luggage wheels, overpriced coffee from the kiosk near Gate 14, and something underneath all of that, something almost industrial, like the building itself was always slightly warm, always slightly humming. The carpet was that particular shade of burgundy and navy that airport designers in the 1990s thought conveyed both energy and calm. It conveyed neither, but it had been there so long that it was now almost comforting in its familiarity, the way bad wallpaper in a grandparent's house becomes beautiful over time. The upper concourse of Terminal D was the premium section, or what passed for premium at Hartwell, which was a mid-size airport with regional ambitions and a renovation project that had been nearly complete for going on for years. The Premier Pathway, that's what the airline called it, Crestline Airways, their branded version of a fast lane, was a glassed-in corridor along the north wall of the concourse, separated from the main terminal foot traffic by a low brushed aluminum barrier and a series of retractable belt posts, the same kind you see at upscale hotels. There was a branded carpet runner, charcoal grey with the Crestline Wings logo repeated at intervals. There were 4 or 5 leather-upholstered chairs along one wall, occupied by people reading on tablets or speaking in the low, urgent voices of business travelers trying to finish calls before boarding. A woman in a Crestline uniform, dark navy blazer, the little silver wing pin on the lapel, stood at the Premier Pathway entrance with a scanner and the specific expression of someone who has worked in customer service long enough to have a face that says nothing at all. The gate for Flight 447 to New York was at the far end of the corridor, past the lounge alcove, past the water bottle filling station, past the mural of the Mid-Southers rolling hills that the airport had commissioned, and that was, by any honest assessment, a little too green and a little too pastoral to be historically accurate. The overhead speakers were doing the thing they always do, half announcements, boarding group calls for gates on the other side of the terminal, a weather advisory that no one listened to because it was always being issued and nothing ever came of it. A child somewhere near gate 12 was laughing at something with the full body commitment that only children under 5 are still capable of. A rolling suitcase wheel squeaked on the tile in an irregular rhythm, receding toward the south corridor. 200 people. Gate areas, corridor, the open main concourse below. People going places, people coming back, people waiting. Witnesses, as it turned out. All of them witnesses, though none of them knew it yet. Marcus Webb stood at the Premier Pathway entrance with his boarding pass open on his phone and his carry-on bag slung over one shoulder. And then it started. He had gotten there at 3:47 in the afternoon, which he knew exactly because he had checked the time on his phone when he came off the escalator from the main concourse floor, a habit, the way people who have spent years in high-stakes meetings develop reflexive time awareness. He had a 4:55 departure. He had cleared security in 12 minutes. He was early. He was calm. He was exactly where his ticket said he was supposed to be. The Premier Pathway entrance was manned by 2 Crestline employees. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, the kind of build that made the blazer look slightly inadequate, was named Garrett, according to his name tag. The other, a younger woman with her hair pulled back and the stiff posture of someone still fairly new to the uniform, was named Dee. Dee had already clocked Marcus walking up, had already begun to smile in the way that good service employees smile, open, ready. Garrett got there first. "Sir." Not a question. A placement. Marcus slowed his walk. "Hey. How are you doing? This is the Premier Pathway." "Yeah." Marcus tilted his phone screen slightly toward the scanner. "I've got a Premier ticket." Garrett's eyes moved, not to the phone, not to the boarding pass, but to Marcus. Up, then down. Quick. The kind of assessment that isn't about a ticket at all. "Can I see your ID?" Marcus paused. "Just for a moment. My boarding pass is right here. Policy is ID for Premier boarding." Dee, behind Garrett, had a look on her face. Not quite alarm, not quite surprise, the specific expression of someone who knows something is wrong but hasn't decided yet whether it's their place to say so. "I've flown Premier on Crestline 9 times this year," Marcus said. He kept his voice even. He had practice keeping his voice even. "I've never been asked for ID at the corridor." "Policy changed," Garrett said. He didn't elaborate. He looked at Marcus the way you look at something you've decided doesn't quite belong somewhere, and you're just waiting for it to agree with you and move along. Marcus unlocked his phone. He pulled up the Crestline app. His account, his status, Premier Elite, the top tier, the little silver crown icon that had never, in 9 trips and more miles than he cared to count, required him to show identification to walk down a carpeted corridor. He held the screen up. Garrett glanced at it. Looked away. "I'm going to need you to step aside, sir." "Excuse me." "You're blocking the entrance." Marcus looked behind him. There was no one behind him. The entrance was completely clear. He turned back. "There's no one there," he said. "Sir, there is literally no one behind me." A woman pulling a wheelie bag had drifted close enough to overhear. She slowed, pretending she was checking the departures board on the wall. "I'm going to need to see your ID, and if you're not going to provide it, I'm going to need you to move to the general boarding queue." Garrett's voice had taken on that particular register, professionally firm, just a shade louder than necessary, the voice of someone who has decided that volume is a form of authority. "You just told me the policy changed." Marcus's voice was still level. Still quiet. "Can you show me where that policy is documented?" "I don't have that available right now." "You don't have the policy available." "Sir, can you get a supervisor, please?" Garrett's jaw tightened. A small thing, barely visible. But Marcus noticed it. He was very good at noticing small things. "I am the senior agent on this concourse right now." "Then I'd like to speak to someone above you." A beat. A long one. The overhead speaker did a full boarding announcement for a flight to Charlotte, and no one in the immediate area moved or spoke until it was finished, as if the announcement had created a kind of intermission. Then Garrett stepped forward. And that was the moment. The moment everything changed. Because Garrett stepped forward and put his hand on Marcus's arm, just above the elbow, fingers wrapping around the fabric of the jacket, and said, loudly, in the voice he had been calibrating up to this whole time, "Sir, I am asking you to come with me." Not a suggestion. Not a question. The hand on the arm was its own sentence. Marcus went very still. It is a kind of stillness that some people learn over decades, the practiced, deliberate absolute stillness of a man who has spent his life in rooms where the wrong reaction would cost him everything he had worked for, where the system is structured so that if you respond to being treated badly, you become the problem instead of the person who caused it. That stillness was the product of 47 years of discipline, and in this moment, Marcus was calling on every single year of it. "Get your hand off of me," he said. Quiet. Precise. For words. Garrett did not get his hand off of him. "Sir, you are disrupting. Get your hand off of me." He looked directly at Garrett. Not heated. Not pleading. Just clear. The look of a man who knows his own name. D made a small involuntary sound, almost a breath, almost a word. A man in a grey suit who had been reading by the premier chairs had looked up. A woman with a toddler on her hip had stopped walking. A teenage boy sitting on his luggage near gate 14 had his phone up, and the little light on the camera was on. Marcus did not look at any of them. He looked at Garrett. "You are causing a scene," Garrett said. "If you don't come with me voluntarily, I will call airport security." "Call them," Marcus said. "Please. Call them right now. I would very much like this documented." And then things moved quickly. The radio on Garrett's belt. A clipped exchange. The words disturbance and premier corridor and male passenger not cooperating. Then a 3-minute wait that felt about 20 minutes long, during which Marcus stood exactly where he was standing, did not move, did not raise his voice, and did not lower his eyes. during which Dee said, quietly, under her breath, "Garrett, he has a premier status, I can see it right in the system," and Garrett said, just as quietly but twice as firmly, "Stand down, Dee." During which the woman with the toddler got her own phone out. During which the teenage boy with the camera never moved his eyes from the scene. 2 airport security officers arrived from the south corridor at a fast walk. They were not running, but they were close to it, the specific gait of people who have been told there is something to manage. They were both in their 30s, both broad-shouldered, both in the dark navy of the contracted security company, both wearing the expression of readiness that the job required. The first one's name tag said Blevins. He looked at Garrett. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Garrett again. "What's the situation?" "Passenger is refusing to comply with verification procedures and is blocking the Premier Pathway entrance." Blevins looked at Marcus. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass?" Marcus, without a word, held up his phone. Both the Crestline app and the boarding pass, side by side. Blevins looked at the screen. He looked back at Garrett. "He's got a Premier ticket. Policy requires additional verification." "What policy is that?" the second officer said. His tag said Okafor, and his voice was careful, deliberate, the voice of someone running their own quiet calculation. Garrett's jaw went tight again. "It's a recent update to." "Can you show us the documentation?" Okafor said. Silence. Real silence. Not the held breath kind. The empty kind. The kind where the absence of an answer is itself an answer. Garrett squared his shoulders. "I am the senior passenger experience manager on this concourse, and I am asking for this individual to be removed from the corridor." Blevins exhaled. It was the quietest, most professional exhale Marcus had ever witnessed, a complete sentence compressed into a breath. He turned back to Marcus. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. Can I just—" "No," Marcus said. Not angry. Final. "You cannot. Because I have done nothing wrong. I am standing in a place my ticket entitles me to stand, and I have been grabbed by this man in front of every person in this concourse. And I am not moving until someone with the authority to acknowledge what just happened acknowledges it." He said it simply. Clearly. He did not shout. He did not gesture. He was the eye of his own storm. The teenage boy's camera light was still on. 43 seconds of footage that, by the next morning, would be viewed by 6 million people. But Marcus didn't know that yet. And neither did the person across town who was about to change everything. Let's go back. Because you need to understand who Marcus Webb was before you can understand what that moment in Terminal D really meant. Let's go back about 20 years. Further, actually. Let's go back to the beginning. 22 years earlier, Millhaven, Georgia. The town of Millhaven sat in the flat stretch of West Georgia where the pine trees got serious about their business and the kudzu was losing its annual argument with the chain-link fence that ran along Highway 19. It was not a small town, but it had small-town arithmetic. You knew who fixed your car, you knew who delivered your mail, and you could map the entire social landscape of the place from the parking lot of the First Baptist Church on a Sunday morning. Marcus Webb grew up in the east side of Millhaven, in a pale yellow house on Calder Street that his grandfather had built with his own hands in 1961 and that still, if you pressed your palm to the kitchen wall in the right place, had the ghost of the original plaster underneath the drywall. The house smelled like lemon pledge and biscuits and the cedar sachet his grandmother kept in the hallway closet even after she passed, because no one in the family had the heart to take it down. His mother, Gloria, worked at the hospital, not as a nurse, though she had wanted to be a nurse for most of her 20s and had the textbooks to prove it, a shelf full of them in the hallway closet right next to the cedar sachet. She worked the billing department, which meant she was on the phone for 8 hours a day talking to people about their worst moments in the most transactional way imaginable, and she did it with a patience and a grace that Marcus still could not fully account for. She came home in the evenings with her shoes off before she hit the porch, and she made dinner, and she asked about Marcus's day in a voice that made it clear she actually wanted to know, not as a formality, but as a genuine inquiry, the way you'd ask about a book you were invested in. His father, Raymond, drove a delivery truck for a regional warehouse distributor, a route that took him from Millhaven up through the middle of the state and back, Tuesday through Saturday, every week, reliably, for 18 years. Raymond Webb was the kind of man who never talked about work but was always working. He fixed things around the house on Sundays. He coached Marcus's Little League team for 3 seasons even though Raymond had never played organized baseball and had to borrow a coaching manual from the library and read the whole thing before the first practice. He lost every game that first season and didn't apologize for any of them because he said losing was data and data was useful if you paid attention. Marcus paid attention. That was, perhaps, the most defining thing about him from the very beginning. He paid attention. Not in the anxious, hypervigilant way of a child who is afraid to miss something. In the deep, absorbing way of a person who is genuinely curious about how things work, why they work, and what would happen if you changed one variable. He built radios in the garage when he was 11. Not from kits, from component parts he sourced from the Radio Shack 40 minutes away, paying for them with money from mowing 3 neighbors' lawns every Saturday. He built one that actually worked, and the first thing that came through it was a farm report from a station 2 counties over, and Marcus sat in that garage for 20 minutes listening to commodity prices for corn and soybeans with an expression on his face like he had personally invented electricity. He got into Georgia State on a partial scholarship. He worked the other part, 2 jobs, one in a campus library and one as a night stock clerk at a grocery chain, and he carried a 3.9 GPA through for years of it because Raymond had told him, once, in the specific tone Raymond used when he was saying something he meant to last, "Nobody can take what's in your head, son. Everything else is on loan." After Georgia State, Marcus did what very few people from Calder Street had done before him. He got into the MBA program at Emory. He did it on the strength of a personal essay that his advisor later told him was the most precisely argued piece of writing she had read in the entire applicant pool that year. He didn't know that until much later. He was too busy, at the time, trying to figure out how to make one professional outfit last for interviews. The MBA led to a position at a mid-sized logistics firm in Atlanta, which led to a series of increasingly senior roles, which led, through a sequence of risks and decisions and a few genuine moments of almost cinematic luck, to the founding, 12 years ago, of Meridian Capital Group. Meridian started in a rented office above a dry cleaner on Peachtree Industrial. 3 people, Marcus, a financial analyst named Priya who ate at her desk and did not believe in unnecessary punctuation in emails, and a junior associate named Theo who was 24 and so eager he sometimes arrived before the building's fact turned on in the morning. Their first fund was $40 million, which is not a small amount of money but is, in the world of private equity and infrastructure investment, approximately the size of a rounding error. But Marcus had the same quality with money that he had with radios when he was 11. He could hear the signal inside the noise. He could look at an infrastructure portfolio or a transportation network or a logistics supply chain and identify the one thing that the entire system's value actually hinged on, the load-bearing element that everyone else was walking past because it didn't have a label on it. And for Marcus, airlines were the great unseized opportunity of the next decade. Not the passenger experience. Not the brand. The infrastructure. The fuel contracts. The maintenance operations. The cargo capacity that every major carrier was dramatically under-monetizing while they chased loyalty points and premium cabin upgrades. He saw it before almost anyone else in the investment world, and he built a fund strategy around it, and when the strategy worked, and it worked spectacularly, he built it into a portfolio, and when the portfolio compounded, it became something that required a different kind of mathematics to describe. $5.2 billion in active managed assets as of last Thursday. 37% of that in transportation and aviation infrastructure, including, as it happened, a significant position in the holding company that owned 41% of Crestline Airways. But in Terminal D, at 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, none of that was visible on Marcus Webb's face. What was visible was a man in a good jacket with a carry-on bag and a boarding pass on his phone, standing exactly where he was supposed to stand, being told he did not belong there. He had been here before. Not in this terminal. In this feeling. He had been told, in 100 different ways, by 100 different Garretts, that the space he was occupying needed a different kind of explanation from him than it would from someone else. He had learned, over 47 years, to give the explanation calmly. To not perform his credentials, because performing them was its own kind of indignity. To not shout, because shouting made you the problem. To not leave, because leaving was its own kind of defeat. He had learned to stand. That was the whole lesson, really. Just stand. Hold the ground. Let the facts eventually arrange themselves around you, because they will, if you give them enough room. What he had not yet learned, what he was about to learn, in the coming weeks, was that sometimes standing is not enough, and the facts need help arriving. He had a phone call to make. The most important phone call of this whole story. But first, across town, in a glass-walled office overlooking the river bend, another chapter was already in motion. Simultaneously, Hartwell Financial District, 24th floor, Crestline Airways corporate headquarters. The view from Vivienne Ashford's office was, by any objective measure, stunning. The Hartwell River made a wide, slow bend just south of the financial district, and from the 24th floor of the Crestline corporate building you could see the full arc of it, the brown-green water catching the afternoon light, the far bank with its trees still holding a few late autumn red leaves, the railway bridge in the distance with its old iron latticework going rust-orange in the October sun. Vivienne had worked in this office for 11 years and she still sometimes stopped mid-sentence in a meeting to look at the river, which her assistant Deandra found endearing and her board members found mildly alarming. Vivienne Ashford was the president of Crestline Airways. Not the CEO, she would clarify the distinction with anyone who got it wrong, not out of vanity but out of precision, because the difference mattered in terms of authority, responsibility, and the specific flavor of crisis that was going to land on your desk at 7 in the morning. The CEO, a man named Clifton Brace, who had been with Crestline for 22 years and had the golf handicap to prove his commitment to being unreachable on weekends, was in London for a board meeting with the International Holding Group. Which meant that today, effectively, Vivienne was running the airline. She was 51 years old, with natural silver threading through dark hair she wore pulled back in a low knot, and the bearing of someone who had grown up understanding that rooms do not give you their authority, you either bring it with you or you don't. She had started at Crestline as a director of route operations, had rebuilt the regional scheduling system in her second year in a way that saved the airline $12 million annually, and had spent the decade since making herself indispensable in the specific way that requires you to know more about the system than anyone else in the room and to never, ever let that look like showing off. She was brilliant. She was occasionally terrifying. And she had, in the past 4 years, forged one of the more productive professional relationships of her career with a private equity fund manager named Marcus Elliott Webb. It had started at a transportation investment summit in Chicago 4 years ago now, a breakfast panel where Marcus had said something about cargo infrastructure that was so precise and so counterintuitive that Vivienne, halfway through her coffee, had put the cup down and said, across the table, to no one in particular, "Who is that?" They had spoken for 40 minutes after the panel. They had met again 3 weeks later in Atlanta, for what was supposed to be an hour and ran to 3.5. They had developed the kind of working relationship that serious people develop when they recognize each other, not friendship exactly, not yet, but a mutual respect that had its own grammar, its own shorthand, its own way of cutting directly to the heart of any problem in the fewest words possible. Marcus's fund, Meridian Capital, had committed to a significant investment in Crestline's parent holding company 18 months ago. More than that, he was, at this moment, in the process of finalizing the terms of a second, expanded commitment, a commitment that Vivienne had spent the better part of 6 months cultivating, negotiating, and positioning within the holding group's strategic framework. A commitment that would bring Meridian's total exposure to Crestline's infrastructure to just over $5 billion. The call that morning had been good. The call that morning had been, actually, spectacular. Marcus's tone had that quality it got when he was satisfied, a kind of quiet precision, and he had said, "Tell your people at the holding group to expect documentation by end of week, Vivienne. I think we're there." And Vivienne had told Deandra, after the call, to go ahead and book the celebration dinner she'd been holding in reserve, because it was happening. Now, at 4:15 in the afternoon, Vivienne was in her weekly operations review meeting, sitting at the long table with 6 of her senior directors, a presentation on the screen about load factors and gate utilization, and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her covered in handwriting that no one but Deandra could decode, and she was in the middle of a pointed question about fuel procurement contracts when her phone, face up on the table, lit up. Not a call. A news alert. She had Crestline set as a keyword alert, old habit, the kind of thing you do when you're running an airline and you need to know before Twitter knows. The alert preview was just a few words, pulled from a social media post that was apparently gaining traction fast. The words were enough. Crestline employee removes black passenger from Premier video. Vivienne picked up the phone. Looked at the screen. Read it again. "Give me a minute," she said, to no one in particular, and everyone at the table went quiet because Vivienne Ashford's voice had a specific register it took when something important was happening, and this was it. She navigated to the post. The video was 43 seconds long. It was shot from an angle slightly above and to the left, the quality of a phone held steady by someone who knew to hold it steady, and in the 43 seconds it covered, the following things were visible. A tall Crestline employee with his hand gripping the upper arm of a man in a charcoal jacket. That man, still and composed in a way that was somehow more powerful than any display of anger could have been. The Crestline employee using the word disturbance in a voice loud enough to carry. The man with the charcoal jacket saying, clearly and quietly, "Get your hand off of me." The Crestline employee not getting his hand off of him. Vivienne watched it once. Then she watched it again. She set the phone down on the table with a care that was very precise and also very controlled, and she looked at her director of passenger experience, a man named Seth, who was already checking his own phone with an expression like a man who has just heard something fall in another room and is hoping it was something small. "Seth," she said. "I'm seeing it," he said. "Terminal D Premier Pathway." She was not asking. "Yes." "Who is the employee?" Seth was on his radio. 30 seconds of clipped exchange. Senior Passenger Experience Manager. Name is Garrett Hollis. Vivienne stood up. The operations review meeting, it turned out, was over. "I want to know," she said, pulling her jacket from the chair back with the efficiency of someone who has made emergency decisions in motion before, "who that passenger is. I want to know in the next 10 minutes. And someone call the airport liaison and get me a contact at terminal security." She was already at the door when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. It was Marcus. She stopped. Something cold moved through her chest, not fear exactly. More like the specific, sinking recognition of someone who has just connected two things that, together, are much worse than either one alone. "Marcus," she answered. "Vivienne." His voice was the same as always, even, measured, the voice of a man who doesn't waste his tone on what his words can carry. "I want to be very straightforward with you right now. I'm still at Hartwell Airport. I've just had an experience with a member of your staff that I need to tell you about." Vivienne was already walking toward the elevator. "I know," she said. "I'm coming to you right now." Silence on the line. "Just a beat." "You know," Marcus said. "There's a video," she said. 43 seconds. It's already at 2 million views. Another beat. Then, and this was the thing about Marcus that Vivienne had come to understand over 4 years, this was the thing that made him who he was, he didn't say good or you see or anything that tasted like vindication. He said, "I see. Then we should talk in person." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Vivienne said. She pressed the elevator button. Took a breath. The river was still doing its beautiful thing out the window at the end of the corridor, unhurried, indifferent, light on the water. 20 minutes. She made it in 14. But let's slow down. Because the 43-second video was only the surface of this, the very top layer of a thing that went much deeper, and had been going much deeper for much longer than one October afternoon in Terminal D. 3 weeks before Marcus's encounter at the Premier Pathway, a woman named Loretta Sims had filed a formal complaint with Crestline Airways Passenger Relations Department. Loretta was 58 years old, a retired high school principal from Hartwell's Oakdale neighborhood, a grandmother of 4, and a woman who had spent 31 years teaching children to advocate for themselves and had therefore developed, in her retirement, a comprehensive and patient approach to advocating for herself. She had platinum-dyed hair and wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she did not, as a general rule, let things go. What happened to Loretta Sims on a Wednesday in September was this: she had boarded a Crestline flight in the general boarding queue with a standard economy ticket, and had been seated in the window seat of row 22 with a carry-on bag that she had measured. She had measured it, she told the complaints department, with a tape measure she kept in her purse precisely because this had happened to her before, and that was, by her measurements and the airline's published guidelines, within the permitted dimensions. A Crestline flight attendant had stopped her in the aisle and told her the bag was oversized and needed to be checked. Loretta had noted the dimensions. The flight attendant had said the dimensions were not the only consideration, that the shape of the bag also mattered, which was not in the published guidelines anywhere that Loretta could find. A supervisor had been called. The supervisor agreed with the flight attendant. The bag was checked at the gate. Loretta was charged a late gate check fee. The bag, when it arrived on the carousel, had a broken zipper. The complaint she filed was not primarily about the broken zipper, though she mentioned it. It was about what happened between the moment the flight attendant stopped her and the moment the bag was taken, the way the conversation had gone, the words used, the specific quality of the attention paid to her versus the man in the row behind her, a white man in his 60s with a bag that Loretta estimated, with the trained eye of a woman who had spent 30 years navigating school budgets and equipment storage, was approximately the same dimensions as hers, and whose bag was not looked at. She filed the complaint in writing, 7 pages, single-spaced, with the tape measure dimensions annotated. She received, 3 weeks later, a form letter with a $300 travel credit and a sentence about Crestline's commitment to equitable service. She sent the travel credit back. And she wrote a second letter, this one to the corporate office, attention to the president, and she said in this letter, among other things, that she had spoken with 6 other people in the Oakdale community who had had similar experiences on Crestline flights, experiences that shared certain patterns, experiences that she believed constituted not isolated incidents but a systemic problem, and that she was prepared to document and escalate this beyond Crestline's internal process if the internal process continued to produce form letters and travel credits. This letter, unlike the first one, which had been processed by a junior complaints coordinator and resolved with the standard matrix response, this letter had landed, eventually, on the desk of Seth, Vivienne's director of passenger experience. Seth had read it. Seth had drafted a response to it, a more personalized response, with a call to follow up, the kind of response that was supposed to represent escalated care. The response had not yet been sent. It was sitting in Seth's outbox, in the category of things that needed to happen but had not happened yet because the operations review meeting kept running long and the load factor presentations kept requiring more attention than they should. The response had been sitting there for 11 days. And then, 6 days before Marcus Webb stood in Terminal D, a man named Darius Holloway had had his own experience at Hartwell Airport, also at the Crestline Premier Pathway, also involving verification requests that were not, by any reading of Crestline's published policies, actually required. Darius was 34, a software engineer, a Premier member, and he had a record of the exchange on his own phone, not video, audio, that he had recorded because, as he later told a reporter, by the third time something like this happens to you, you start keeping records. The third time. Darius had not filed a formal complaint. He had posted about it on social media, a text post, no video, and it had gotten a modest amount of engagement within his own network but had not broken out into wider circulation. It was sitting there, 14 days old, with its timestamp and its account and its followers, waiting to be found. And over at Crestline's corporate communications department, a woman named Tara Price, who handled social media monitoring, had flagged both Loretta's second letter and Darius's post in the same internal report, 3 weeks ago, a report she sent weekly to Seth about sentiment trends and emerging issues. She had marked them both as medium priority, pattern worth watching. Medium priority. Pattern worth watching. The report had been read. Acknowledged with a brief reply. Filed. And Garrett Hollis, the senior passenger experience manager on Terminal DS Upper Concourse, had continued to work his shifts through all of it, with no additional guidance, no retraining, no policy clarification, no conversation from management about the specific and documented pattern of what was happening at that Premier Pathway entrance on his watch. This is what Seth was thinking about, sitting in that meeting room at corporate headquarters, when Vivienne stood up and said she was going to the airport. Because Seth knew about Loretta's letter. And Seth knew about Darius's post. And Seth knew about his own unsent response sitting in his outbox. And Seth was, in this moment, sitting with the very particular and awful awareness of a man who has watched a thing build and not stopped it, not because he didn't see it but because medium priority had felt, at the time, like enough. It wasn't enough. It was, in the vocabulary of actual consequences, nothing. And now it was a 6 million view video and a phone call between the president of Crestline Airways and the man who was in the middle of signing a $5 billion commitment to the holding company that owned the airline. Seth picked up his phone. He called Tara in communications. "Pull everything," he said. "Everything we have on the Premier Pathway complaints going back 12 months. All of it. Get it to my tablet in the next hour." His voice was steady. His hands were not. There was more. Because there is always more, in these situations, than the surface incident. Garrett Hollis, it turned out, had 3 internal conduct notes in his personnel file, the kind that aren't formal warnings but represent the recorded opinions of supervisors who observed something and wrote it down without escalating it. 3 notes in 4 years. All 3 described situations involving black passengers. One described a situation remarkably similar to what Marcus had just experienced, a verification request that no policy supported, a hand on an arm, an escalation to security. 3 notes. No formal action. No retraining. No conversation with HR. Just 3 pieces of paper in a file that no one had looked at together, in sequence, as a pattern. They had been looked at separately, as individual incidents, each one just barely beneath the threshold that would have triggered a formal process. 3 times. Just below the line. Every time. Because the line had been drawn in a place that made it very easy to stay just below it. And none of this would have come to light, not Loretta's letters, not Darius's recording, not the 3 conduct notes, not the unsent response in Seth's outbox, if it hadn't been for one teenager at gate 14 with a phone and a steady hand. The video was at 9 million views by the time Vivienne's car pulled into the airport parking structure. Back at Terminal D, for 28 p.m. Marcus was in a small glass-walled room off the main concourse that the airport called the Passenger Resolution Center, which was, in practice, a room with 4 chairs, a table, a box of tissues, and a water cooler that made a noise every 40 seconds. Airport operations had offered him the room, and Marcus had accepted it with the understanding that he was not being asked to leave the public area but was accepting a private space voluntarily. He had made that distinction out loud, calmly, in front of both security officers, so that it was clear. Okafor, the security officer, had stayed nearby. Not in the room, outside, but visible through the glass. He had, at one point, brought Marcus a cup of water without being asked. Marcus had thanked him. Marcus sat with his phone in his hands. He had called his chief of staff, a woman named Camille Rhee, who had the specific tone of voice she used when she was pulling information simultaneously across 3 different platforms and talking at the same time. She told him, in 2 minutes, that the video was trending. He told her to document everything, the flight details, the timestamp, the names on the name tags he had memorized, the security report number if there was one. "Marcus," Camille said. "Are you okay?" He thought about that for a moment. He looked at the water in the cup. He thought about the pressure of Garrett's hand on his arm. He thought about Dee's face, the not quite alarm expression, the person who knew but didn't know what to do with what she knew. "I'm okay," he said. "I'm angry. But I'm okay." "Those are compatible," Camille said. "Yeah," Marcus said. "They are." He set the phone down on the table. Picked it back up. Looked at the screen. He had not yet called Vivienne. But Vivienne had called him first, which told him something. It told him the video was visible. It told him the scale of this had already exceeded the terminal. It told him that this was going to be a public conversation whether or not he chose to make it one. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about his parents. He thought about Raymond Webb driving that delivery route, Tuesday through Saturday, 18 years, and what Raymond might have thought about this room, this table, this water cooler making its 40-second noise. He thought about what Raymond would have said about what happened at the Premier Pathway. He knew exactly what Raymond would have said. Raymond had a phrase for moments like this, situations where the system had shown you something it would have preferred to keep hidden. He'd lean back, and he'd say, real quiet, "Well, now we know. Well, now we know." Marcus sat up straighter. He was going to need to think very carefully about what came next. Because the decision he was approaching, the decision that was taking shape in the back of his mind the way decisions do when you've been building to them longer than you realized, was not an angry decision. Anger was too simple for this. What he was feeling was more like clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you've been seeing something partially for a long time, and then one moment snaps the whole picture into focus. He heard footsteps in the corridor outside the glass. He looked up. Vivienne Ashford was walking toward him, alone, at a pace that made it clear she was in a hurry and also that she had something to say. He stood. And the 2 threads of this story pulled into the same room. The door opened. Vivienne stood in the frame for just a moment, coat still on, hair slightly disarranged from the speed of getting here, the expression on her face the one Marcus had seen twice before, in meetings when something had gone very wrong and she was running the first response calculation in real time. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and then she crossed the room and, something that surprised them both, perhaps, she put her hand briefly on his arm. The same arm Garrett had grabbed. But entirely different. The touch of someone saying "I see you" without the words. She sat down across from him. Pulled off her coat. Set it on the chair beside her. "Tell me everything," she said. He told her everything. He did it the way he did most things, sequentially, factually, with the relevant details in the right order and the unnecessary ones left out. He told her about arriving at the Premier pathway. About the verification request that had no policy basis. About Garrett's hand on his arm. About the security call, and Okafor and Blevins, and the way Dee had said he has Premier status, I can see it in the system, and had been told to stand down. Vivienne listened without interrupting. She took no notes. She was doing what she always did when the information mattered, storing it in order, parsing it in real time, building the response structure while she was still receiving the input. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "This is not the first time," she said. "Not at this corridor. Not with this employee. And not," she paused, and Marcus could see her deciding how much to say, deciding to say all of it. "Not the first time on this airline." He looked at her steadily. "How many times?" "We're still pulling the full picture," she said. "But there are at least 2 documented complaints that I'm aware of in the last 2 months. And 3 conduct notes in the employee's file that were never escalated." Silence. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely curious. "Because you deserve to know it," Vivienne said. "And because I think," she stopped. Pressed her lips together. Started again. "I think that if you had been anyone else, if you had been a passenger without a voice that people would listen to, this conversation would not be happening right now. And I'm angry about that. I'm angry at my own system for making that true." Marcus nodded slowly. He looked at the table. Then at her. "And the investment," he said. It wasn't a question exactly, more of a clearing of the air, a naming of the thing that was in the room with them. Vivienne met his eyes. "That is entirely your decision to make, and I am not here to influence it. What I'm here to do is to make sure you know that whatever decision you make, I am going to be accountable for what happened today, personally, not just corporately. And I'm going to be accountable for what I didn't do about the pattern before today." Outside the glass door, Okafor was still in the corridor. Beyond him, Marcus could see the main concourse, the foot traffic, the gate areas, the world going about its business. He could see, distantly, the Premier pathway entrance. He could see, if he looked, the spot where he had been standing when a hand closed around his arm and told him, without words, that he needed more explanation than anyone should need. "I want to meet the other people," Marcus said. "The ones who filed the complaints." Vivienne paused. "I can facilitate that. If they consent." "Good." Marcus put his phone on the table. "And I want it documented, today, in writing, by your legal team if necessary, that I did not leave this airport voluntarily, that I was not in violation of any policy, and that I am requesting a full review of the incidents involving this employee and a public accounting of what was found. I'll have my legal team on the phone within the hour, Vivienne said. One more thing, Marcus said. He looked directly at her. I want the man who grabbed me to understand, in clear terms, what he did. Not for me. I want him to understand it for the next person. Because there is always a next person. And I'd like there to be fewer of them. Vivienne nodded. She stood. Then she said, quietly, almost like a thought out loud, do you know what the worst part of this is? In my system? It's that it happened because the system allowed someone to act on an assumption, and the assumption was never challenged. No one challenged it. She looked at him. Not until you refuse to move. Marcus picked up his water cup. Looked at it. My father would say that's the first step, he said. Not moving. Vivienne looked at him. A pause. Then, he sounds like a smart man. He drove a delivery truck for 18 years, Marcus said. He was the smartest man I've ever known. Vivienne put her coat back on. Come on, she said. I'm going to need you out there with me. Marcus stood. Adjusted his jacket. Set down the water cup. Let's go, he said. They walked out of the Passenger Resolution Center together, and in the corridor, the moment Okafor saw Vivienne Ashford, the Crestline logo on her badge, the way she moved, the specific gravity of someone who runs things, he straightened slightly and said, with the careful respect of someone recognizing an authority that resolves his uncertainty about what he was supposed to do in the last 45 minutes. I need Garrett Hollis brought to the main concourse area, Vivienne said, to no one in particular but in a voice that expected someone to comply. Now. And I need the terminal operations manager. Okafor got on his radio. The concourse was about to get very quiet. Terminal D upper concourse, for 51 p.m. They came out of the side corridor and into the main concourse, Vivienne and Marcus, and the first thing Marcus noticed was that it was more crowded than it had been when he was brought to the resolution room. Some of it was just natural concourse accumulation, another wave of passengers between boarding calls, people filtering through from security. But some of it, he understood after a moment, was people who had not gone to their gates yet. People who had seen something earlier. People who, if he was being honest with himself, were waiting to see what happened next. The teenage boy from gate 14 was still there. He was sitting on his bag near the same spot he'd been before, phone still out, watching. When he saw Marcus walk out, he straightened up. When he saw Vivienne Ashford walking beside Marcus, his eyes went wide, and he leaned over to say something to the woman next to him, his mother, probably, who looked up and then looked at the scene developing at the Premier Pathway entrance. Garrett Hollis was already there. He had been brought out by the terminal operations manager, a slight, quick-moving man named Paulson who looked like he had been having a very bad afternoon and expected it to continue. Garrett stood at the Premier Pathway entrance, the same spot, the same carpet runner, the same brushed aluminum barrier, and he had the look of a man who had been briefed, but not fully. Who knew something was happening, but not exactly what. His chin was slightly raised. Defensive. Resolved. Dee was also there, standing a few feet behind and to the side of Garrett, because Dee had apparently not left when her shift adjustment was offered, which said something about Dee. Vivienne stopped a few feet in front of Garrett. She did not look at Paulson. She looked at Garrett. "Mr. Hollis," she said. Her voice was professional, completely controlled, and pitched to carry just far enough, not to the whole concourse, but to the dozen or so people in the immediate area who had already oriented toward what was happening. "I'm Vivienne Ashford. I'm the president of Crestline Airways. We've met once, at the Regional Operations Conference in March." Garrett blinked. "Yes, I want to ask you some questions about what happened this afternoon at this corridor. I want you to understand that this conversation is being documented, and I want you to understand that I am asking you directly, as the airline's president, so there's no ambiguity about the weight of this. Are we clear?" Garrett's chin came down a fraction. "Yes, You stopped a passenger at this corridor and asked for ID verification. That's correct. Can you point me to the policy that requires ID verification for Premier Pathway access?" A pause. A short one, but present. I applied additional screening based on my discretion as senior agent. Your discretion, Vivienne repeated. Just those two words. Not inflected into a question. Just reflected back, clean. Yes. And when the passenger showed you his Premier status in the Crestline app, his account, his status, his boarding pass, all valid, you asked him to step aside. There was a situation developing. There was no one behind him, Marcus said. He said it calmly, from where he stood, just beside and slightly behind Vivienne. He said it as a fact, the way you state a fact that everyone present already knows. Garrett looked at Marcus. Something moved across his face, recognition, maybe, or the specific discomfort of a man who is confronted with someone he thought he had moved on from. "That's true," said a voice. Everyone turned. It was the woman who had stopped and pretended to look at the departures board during the original incident, the one with the wheelie bag. She was still there. She was a compact woman in her 50s in a red coat, and she was looking directly at Garrett with an expression of complete and patient certainty. I was standing right there. There was nobody behind him. I watched the whole thing. "I did too," said the man in the grey suit who had looked up from his reading by the Premier chairs. He was on his feet now, his tablet under his arm. "I've been flying Premier on Crestline for 7 years. I have never been asked to show ID at this corridor. Not once." "I have a recording," said a voice from behind. Everyone turned, and it was Darius Holloway. Marcus turned to look at him. He had not known Darius Holloway was here. He had not known Darius was on the same flight. Camille, his chief of staff, had found Darius's social media post in the hour since the incident, had already flagged it for Marcus with a message that said this is pattern, not isolated, but Marcus hadn't spoken to him yet. And yet here he was, a young man in his early 30s with a messenger bag over one shoulder and the expression of someone who has been carrying a thing for a while and has just found the place to put it down. "You were here," Marcus said. "I'm on the 455, Darius said. He looked at Garrett. "I was here when it happened. I have the recording from my incident 6 weeks ago. And I have the names of at least 2 other people who had the same experience at this specific corridor. Garrett's jaw had gone tight, the same jaw-tightening Marcus had clocked earlier, the micro-expression of a man whose internal certainty was meeting external contradiction and did not know what to do with the impact. "There's more," said Dee. Everyone looked at her, including Garrett, whose neck went slightly rigid. Dee was still standing to the side, but she had moved, subtly, incrementally, the way someone moves when they're making a decision without quite announcing it, so that she was no longer clearly behind Garrett. She was beside him now. Her hands were folded in front of her and her voice was quiet, but she had her chin up. "I want to say something," Dee said, looking at Vivienne. "I want to say it now, on record, in front of all these people, because I didn't say it when I should have and I have to live with that." She stopped, gathered herself. "I could see in the system that Mr. She looked at Marcus, I could see his status. Full Premier Elite. I told Mr. Hollis that. I said it. And I was told to stand down." She paused. "I stood down. And I shouldn't have." The concourse was very quiet now. Not the held breath kind of quiet. The absorbing kind. The kind where people are paying attention because what is happening is important and they know it. Vivienne looked at Dee for a long moment. Something in her expression softened, just briefly. "Thank you," she said. "What's your name?" "Dee," said Dee. "Deidre Okonkwo." "Thank you, Deidre," Vivienne said. She turned back to Garrett. And here is where the evidence arrived, not dramatically, not in a single explosive moment, but in the methodical, undeniable way that real accountability works, which is more like water than lightning. Tara from Communications had, in the previous 45 minutes, compiled and sent to Vivienne's phone the following. Loretta Sims's formal written complaint, including the 7 pages, the tape measure dimensions, and the letter she'd sent back with the travel credit. Darius Holloway's social media post, 14 days old, with its account and timestamp. The 3 conduct notes in Garrett Hollis's personnel file, each one documenting a situation remarkably similar to what had happened this afternoon, each one involving a black passenger, each one just below the formal action threshold. Seth's unsent response in his outbox, which was itself a form of documentation of the knowing and the not acting. Vivienne held up her phone. Not to show Garrett, to acknowledge it, to make it material, to make it real. "I have your personnel file," she said. "I have 3 conduct notes. Each one describes a verification demand placed on a passenger with no policy basis. Each one involves," she stopped, made herself say it, "passengers who are black." She looked at him directly. "I also have a formal complaint from a passenger named Loretta Sims who experienced similar treatment on a Crestline aircraft in September. And a social media account from a Premier member named Darius Holloway who had a nearly identical experience at this corridor 6 weeks ago." She put the phone down. 3 conduct notes. 2 external complaints. 1 incident on video that 11 million people have now seen. She said it quietly. Not like a sentence. Like an arithmetic problem whose answer has been arrived at. Garrett stared at her. His mouth opened. Closed. "I am not asking you to respond right now," Vivienne said. "I am telling you, in front of these witnesses, that this pattern has been documented, and this airline is going to respond to it fully. That response begins today. She turned to Paulson. I want Mr. Hollis placed on administrative review effective immediately. I want HR called in the next 30 minutes. And I want the 3 conduct notes formally escalated and placed in an active investigation file. Paulson was already on his phone. Vivienne turned to the concourse, to the witnesses, to the woman in the red coat, to the grey suit man, to the teenage boy whose camera light, Marcus noticed, was still on, to Darius Holloway, to D. I want to say something to everyone here, she said. Her voice was still controlled, but it had something in it now, something that went under the professional register and was just a person speaking. What happened in this terminal today was wrong. It was wrong because it was discriminatory. It was wrong because it was not isolated. And it was wrong because the systems that are supposed to prevent this kind of thing, the training, the escalation processes, the complaint review, failed. I failed, in part. This airline failed. And I'm sorry for that. To Mr. Webb. To anyone who experienced this and didn't find resolution. That is not the airline I am going to run. Silence. And then, from somewhere near gate 14, someone started clapping. Not enthusiastically, slowly, one person, the kind of applause that says I believe you, I'm going to hold you to it. And then a second person. And then the red coat woman. And then the grey suit man. Marcus did not clap. He was watching Garrett. Garrett Hollis had not spoken since Dee's testimony. He stood with his hands at his sides, and Marcus could see the exact moment when the architecture of his certainty, the conviction that had let him grab a man's arm and tell him he didn't belong there, began to come apart. It didn't come apart all at once. It came apart the way a thing does when you take enough weight-bearing pieces away from it, slowly, then suddenly. He stood there in the uniform with the little silver wing pin, the name tag that said Garrett in the same font as all the other name tags, the radio still on his belt. And he put his hand over his mouth. Just for a moment. A gesture that was unplanned, involuntary, the gesture of a man who has just seen something and cannot take the seeing back. He started. Stopped. Started again. I did not, I don't think I. He couldn't finish the sentence. His voice had gone rough, the particular roughness of emotion pressing on something that doesn't have room to move. Marcus watched him. He watched him the way he watched most things, attentively, without judgment, without either satisfaction or coldness. Just watching. I'm not a, Garrett said, and then stopped, because he knew, and Marcus knew, and everyone watching knew, that finishing that sentence in the most obvious way was both the most common defense and the least sufficient one. That what a person believes about themselves is not the same as what their actions demonstrate. That the gap between those two things is precisely where the harm lives. Garrett lowered his hand. He looked at Marcus. His eyes were wet. Not crying, the very edge of it, the held-back version, the version that a person holds back because they are in a public place and in a uniform and they do not yet know if they are allowed to cry. I am sorry, he said. It was very quiet. Directed at Marcus specifically. I don't know what I thought I was doing. I'm telling you the truth when I say that. I don't know what I saw when I looked at you that made me. He stopped again. Marcus waited. He let the silence have its full duration. "I think I know," Garrett said finally. "I think I do know. And I've been," he exhaled. Long and slow. "I've been telling myself I didn't. And I don't know how to," he looked down. Then back up. "I'm sorry. That's real. That's the only thing I have right now that's real." The concourse was very quiet. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. And then he spoke, and what he said was not what most people, watching, might have expected. "I know you don't think of yourself as a bad person," Marcus said. He kept his voice low, even, the same voice he'd maintained through the whole afternoon. "And I'm not interested in whether you are or you aren't, because that's a conversation for you to have with yourself. What I'm interested in is the next passenger. The one who comes after me. The one who doesn't have the professional resources I have, who doesn't know to stand their ground, who doesn't have someone to call. The one who just gets moved and goes home and feels the way that feels for weeks." Garrett looked at him. "That person," Marcus said, "is who this needs to be about. Not me. Not you. Them." He paused. "You have a choice now," he said. "A real one. Not a performed one, a real one. You can spend the next period of your life being the person who did this to someone, or you can spend it being the person who learned something so hard and so public that it cost you, and then actually changed. Those are both options." A pause. "I can't tell you which one you'll choose. But I want you to know that I am watching, in the way that I'm capable of watching, which is from a position of some influence in this industry. And I want you to know that I think people can change. That's not something I say for show. I actually believe it." He stopped. "Let it sit. But they have to do the work," he said. "All of it. Not the apology. The work." Garrett nodded. He nodded several times, the nod of a man writing something down inside himself. His eyes were still at that edge, still held. "I'll do the work," he said. Quietly. Simply. Marcus looked at him for another moment. "Okay," he said. "Just that. Okay." He turned to Dee. "Thank you," he said. "What you did took something. Don't let anyone tell you different." Dee's eyes were fully wet. She pressed her lips together and nodded twice, quickly, the nod of someone trying to hold themselves together. Marcus turned back to Vivienne. "We have some things to discuss," he said. "Let's find somewhere to sit." Vivienne nodded. She put her hand on his arm, briefly, deliberately, the repetition of the gesture she had used in the resolution room, the same arm, a different meaning entirely. They walked toward the side corridor together, and behind them, slowly, the concourse resumed its ordinary motion. Bags rolling. Announcements overhead. The child near gate 12, still laughing, full body, with the unreserved commitment of someone who had no idea what had just happened in the room next door. Some things, blessedly, continued on. Conference Room B, Crestline Airways Corporate Headquarters, 2 days later. The table was too long for the number of people who needed it, so they sat at one end, Marcus, Vivienne, Seth, who looked like he had not slept in the 2 days since the incident, which was accurate, a woman from Crestline's legal team named Rosalind who wore reading glasses on a rigid frame and had the manner of someone who had heard every version of every corporate crisis and was not surprised by this one but was fully prepared to address it, and a man named Calvin Bright who was a passenger rights advocate and community liaison that Marcus had asked to have present. Also at the table, Loretta Sims, who had driven herself from Oakdale in her 2019 Bic and arrived 17 minutes early and brought a folder of printed documents that she laid out in front of her with the orderly efficiency of a woman who had spent 31 years making sure meetings stayed on track. And Darius Holloway, who had a legal pad and a coffee and the look of someone who has been waiting for this room for a while and intends to use it well. The conversation lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, the following had been agreed upon. First, a full independent audit of Crestline's Premier Pathway access procedures and their application over the previous 24 months, conducted by an outside equity firm with aviation operations expertise, with the results to be made public. Second, a mandatory implicit bias and discrimination response training program for all customer-facing Crestline employees, developed in partnership with Calvin Bright's organization and 3 other community equity groups, to be implemented within 90 days across all Crestline hubs and regional stations. Third, the formal establishment of a passenger equity review board, 5 seats, 3 of which to be held by passengers from communities historically underserved or discriminated against by the airline industry, 2 of which to be held by Crestline operations staff. The board to have real authority, the ability to review escalated complaints, recommend policy changes, and issue public findings. Not advisory. Authoritative. Fourth, a fund. Marcus had come to the table with this already formed, and he put it on the table not as a condition of the investment. He was careful about that, Vivienne was careful about that, they had talked about the distinction at length, but as a parallel initiative, funded through Meridian Capital Group's community investment arm, matched dollar for dollar by Crestline. The Marcus and Gloria Webb Travel Access Fund, named for Marcus and his mother, who had driven him to the airport for the first time when he was 22 years old and told him, standing in the terminal, that the whole world was accessible if you could just get yourself through the right doors. The fund would provide travel grants, logistical support, and passenger rights education to families and individuals from underserved communities, so that the right doors were not exclusively opened by the right bank account. The initial endowment, $2 million. Joint funding. With a review mechanism to grow it based on the audit's findings. Seth, who had presented, without being asked, a full accounting of his own failures in the complaint escalation process, a presentation that was the most uncomfortable and also the most honest thing he had done in years, proposed a 5th measure, a named internal protocol within Crestline's complaints management system, redesigned so that any complaint involving a pattern match across multiple incidents would automatically be flagged for senior review, not discretionary mid-level review. He proposed naming it the Sims Protocol, for Loretta. Loretta, sitting across the table with her folder and her reading glasses and the paper travel credit she had sent back, looked at Seth for a long moment when he said this. "That's a nice gesture," she said. "But I'll tell you what I want more than my name on something." She looked around the table. "I want to know that the next person who sends a 7-page letter with tape measure dimensions gets a phone call within 48 hours from a human being, not a form letter with a travel credit." "That is also in the protocol," Seth said. Loretta considered this. Then she said, with the decisive nod of a woman who has spent 31 years approving and rejecting proposals, "Good. Keep my name on it." Darius said he wanted one more thing, and this was the thing that Marcus, privately, thought was the best idea in the room. Darius wanted the audio of his own incident, the one he'd been carrying around in his phone for 6 weeks, to be included as a training case study in the new employee program. Not anonymized. Named. His name, his experience, his voice on that recording as a teaching document for every new Crestline employee going forward. Not to embarrass anyone, he said. To make it real. Because training that's hypothetical, training that uses made-up scenarios, it's easy to distance yourself from that. If they hear a real voice, a real person's voice, saying I've flown Premier 3 times and I'm being asked to verify ID and I don't understand why, that's a different kind of lesson. That one sticks. Marcus looked at Darius across the table. That one sticks, he repeated. They shook on it. And then, in a moment that no one had planned, that arrived the way the most significant moments do, Loretta Sims pulled a fresh page out of her folder, slid it across the table to Vivienne, and said, I want to say one thing for the record, for whatever documentation you're keeping of this meeting. She waited until she had the room's attention, which did not take long because Loretta Sims had the natural command of someone accustomed to 30 people looking at her. I did not come here expecting this, she said. I came here prepared to fight, because that's what I've always had to do, and what most people I know have always had to do. And I am not naive, I know that today's agreements need to be tomorrow's actions, and I'll be watching for that. And so will my community, and I expect you to know that. She looked at each person at the table in turn. But I also want to say, because I believe in saying the thing that's true, that I am grateful to be in this room. That's it. I'm grateful. Because most of the time, we don't get the room. She took her glasses off. Looked at Marcus. You got us the room, she said. Marcus looked at her. You were already at the door, he said. Knocking. He paused. I just happened to have a louder knock. The investment, when the documentation went through at the end of that week, was confirmed at $5.2 billion. Not $5 billion. The additional $200 million was Meridian's contribution to the fund and program infrastructure, Marcus's own addition, finalized in the document at the same time as the main commitment, because he believed in making the ethical and the financial legible to each other in the same transaction. The document went to the holding group's London office. Clifton Brace, the CEO, who had been kept informed from London throughout, sent a response that was 3 paragraphs of corporate gratitude and one very short, final paragraph that just said, I understand what this took. I won't forget it. Vivienne forwarded the response to Marcus without comment. He read it. Forwarded it to Camille with the note, hold for reference. Camille replied, always. Crestline Airways issued a public statement 3 days after the incident. It was 16 paragraphs long, which for a public corporate statement is nearly a confession of how much there was to address. It named the Passenger Equity Review Board. It named the training program. It named the fund. It named Loretta Sims's complaint and acknowledged it by name. It acknowledged that internal escalation had failed. It acknowledged the 3 conduct notes in Garrett Hollis's file. It did not name Hollis in the public statement, but it said that a formal conduct review process was underway and that the findings would be reflected in personnel decisions. The statement was read, analyzed, and debated for a week across every media platform that covered business, equity, and aviation. Some people said it wasn't enough. Some said it was more than they'd expected from a major carrier. Loretta Sims was interviewed on 3 local news programs and 1 national morning show, and in each interview she said, with the same patient precision, "I'm going to hold them to it. That's my job now." Darius Holloway was invited to speak at a passenger rights conference for weeks later. He said yes. Dee Okonkwo was not disciplined for standing down when Garrett told her to, a determination reached after full review, with the reasoning documented, because the expectation of junior employees to override senior agents requires institutional protection that wasn't there at the time. 3 months later, she was promoted. The promotion was recommended by Vivienne personally. 1 year later, October, Hartwell International Airport, Terminal D. The carpet had been replaced. Not as a symbol, as part of the 4-year renovation project that had finally, genuinely, actually been completed, and the new carpet in Terminal D's upper concourse was a deep slate blue, clean and bright, the Crestline Wings logo rendered in a lighter silver at intervals, the same logo but a different feeling somehow. Like the same word in a clearer font. The Premier Pathway barrier was still there, the brushed aluminum posts, the retractable belts, but there was a new printed sign at the entrance, black lettering on white cardstock in the airline's font, that read, "Crestline Premier Pathway, all Premier Elite members welcome. Boarding pass and app verification sufficient for access. For policy questions, please ask any team member." Not dramatic. Just clear. The way things should have always been, just clear. Deidre Okonkwo was working the Premier Pathway entrance that afternoon. She had a new title on her badge now, Senior Passenger Experience Lead, and she wore it with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned the word senior in a way she could actually explain, step by step, if you asked her about it. She probably would not tell you the whole story unless you pressed her, and even then she'd probably start with "there was this afternoon, about a year ago," and then stop and smile a little, because the story was still, even now, a lot to hold. The afternoon light was doing the same thing it had done 1 year before, the low October light, the amber wash through the east-facing windows, the same quality of gold and ordinary that turns everything a little more significant than it might otherwise seem. The weather was slightly warmer than last year. The child near Gate 12 was probably a different child entirely, but it could have been the same laugh. Marcus Webb came up the escalator from the main concourse floor at 3:44 p.m. He had a different bag this time, slightly smaller, lighter, the bag of a man who has gotten better over the past year at packing only what he needs. He had a Crestline boarding pass on his phone for the 4:55 to New York, yes, the same flight, because the 4:55 was a good flight and he'd been taking it for going on 10 years now. He walked toward the Premier Pathway entrance. Deidre looked up. She smiled, not the studied smile of a service professional, the real one, the one that happens without prompting. "Mr. Webb," she said. He stopped. Looked at the new sign. Looked at her. "Dee," he said, with the warmth he reserved for people who have done something that cost them. Traveling light today, she noted, with the practiced observational ease of someone who's good at her job and happy being good at it. "Learning," he said. She scanned his boarding pass, clean, instant, the scanner light going green with the easy confidence of a system that works the way it's supposed to work. Premier Elite, she confirmed, for no one but the principal of the thing. Go right ahead, Mr. Webb. Thank you, D. He walked through. Behind him, through the glass corridor windows, the concourse went on being its ordinary self, bags rolling, voices overlapping, the overhead speakers doing their announcements, people going places, people coming back. The water bottle station. The mural of the rolling hills that was still slightly too green but had grown on people over the years. The leather chairs in the alcove, occupied. Marcus walked the length of the premier pathway to the lounge alcove at the far end, set his bag down, and Saturday. He had 10 minutes before boarding. He pulled out his phone, not to work, not to check in, just the reflexive habit, and on the screen he had a text from Camille, who was also his chief of staff and, over the last year, had become something closer to a collaborator in the sense that goes beyond professional titles. The text said, Loretta's keynote for the equity conference is confirmed. She asked if you'd be there. I said I'd ask. He smiled. He texted back, tell her yes. I'd love to hear her. He looked up from his phone. Through the glass wall of the premier corridor, he could see the main concourse below, the full width of it, hundreds of people in motion, the whole human geography of an airport on an October afternoon. He watched it for a moment the way you watch something you thought about a great deal and wanted to see with your own eyes confirmed to be still there. He thought about his father, Raymond Webb, who drove a delivery route Tuesday through Saturday for 18 years, who read a baseball coaching manual from cover to cover because that was how you showed up prepared for things that were outside your experience, who said nobody can take what's in your head, son, with the specific weight of someone who had tested that proposition personally and found it to be true. He thought about his mother, Gloria. The lemon pledge and the biscuits and the shelf of nursing textbooks that were never used for nursing but were used constantly for everything else, because knowledge does not expire and it never cares what room you read it in. He thought about the first time he stood in an airport terminal, 22 years old, his mother's hand briefly on his back and her voice saying the whole world is accessible, Marcus, if you can just get through the right doors. He thought about what it had cost, and what it had produced, and what it was still producing, right now, every day, in the named protocol in a complaints management system, in the training program running in every Crestline hub, in Darius Holloway at his conference podium, in Loretta Sims with her reading glasses and her righteous, patient, determined voice doing the work that she had always done and would continue to do. In D, at the entrance to this corridor, smiling the real smile. In the sign on the Premier pathway that said, simply, clearly, all Premier Elite members welcome. 3 words that should have never needed to be said but, being said, had changed something. Boarding was announced. Marcus stood. Picked up his bag. Walked to the gate. He handed his boarding pass to the agent, a young man, new badge, the specific attentive expression of someone still learning the job. The scanner went green. Have a great flight, sir, the young man said. Thank you, Marcus said. And he meant it, not as formality, not as performance. As genuine gratitude for a simple, human interaction that went exactly the way it was supposed to go. He walked down the jetway and thought, this is what it should always feel like. He was right. I have been telling stories for a long time. And the ones that stay with me, the ones I carry home and think about in the quiet parts of the day, are never really about the dramatic moments. They're about the moments just before and just after. The stillness of a man deciding not to move. The small voice of a junior employee who finally says the thing she should have said earlier. The 7-page letter with tape measure dimensions that a retired principal sends because she believes, despite everything, that the system can be made to hear her. Those are the moments that matter. Not the confrontation. What the confrontation reveals. Because here is what Marcus Webb's story is really about. Underneath the terminal and the video and the investment, it's about the difference between dignity that is granted and dignity that is inherent. Garrett Hollis's assumption, and it was an assumption, not a policy, not a reason, just an assumption, was that dignity at that corridor had to be verified. Earned. Proved. Marcus's entire life had been, in one way or another, about refusing that premise. About standing in the space you're entitled to stand in, not because someone has recognized you there, but because you know you belong there, and you are willing to hold that knowledge in your body while everyone around you is working from a different version of the story. That costs something. It costs enormously, over a lifetime, to stand in that place. And the people who do it, who hold the ground, who file the 7-page letters, who make the 43-second recordings and keep them in their phones because by the third time it happens you start keeping records, those people are not asking for admiration. They're asking for a world that doesn't require that of them. A world where the scanner just goes green. That's the work. Not one incident, not one resolution meeting, not one named protocol. The sustained, unglamorous, necessary work of building the world where the scanner just goes green every time, for every person, and no one thinks twice about it, because it has simply always been true. So here is what I want to ask you, and I want you to take a second with it before you answer. Have you ever stayed quiet when you knew you should have spoken? When you saw something, knew it was wrong, and the cost of saying so felt too high, and so you didn't? I'm not asking to judge you. I'm asking because that moment, the moment Dee had, the moment Seth had, the moment we all have at some point, that moment is where so much of the harm in the world lies. Not in the Garretts. In the standing down of the people who could stop them. If you've had that moment, and you're thinking about what you'd do differently, I want to hear from you. In the comments, right now, tell me just one word. The one word that describes what you would do differently if you got that moment back. One word. That's all. Just one. Because I believe in the power of naming things, even small things. Maybe especially small things. Thank you for watching this today. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way through. That's not nothing. That's you saying that this kind of story matters, and it does, and you do. Next time, we're going to a very different setting, a hospital waiting room, a phone call that gets answered at the exact wrong time, and a woman named June who does something in the next 90 seconds that takes 30 years to fully understand. You're going to want to be here for that one. Hit subscribe if you haven't. Come back when you're ready. And until then, stand your ground. Say the thing. Go through the door. The whole world is accessible if you can just get through the right doors.